So now we'll jump into the harvesting standards, and I've broken this up a bit. First, I'm going to talk about timber harvesting in shoreland zones, and then we'll talk about land management roads and water crossings. So there's sort of three sections to this, and I'll cover the applicable standards for all of those. Again, this isn't every detail of the rule. We wouldn't have time enough here to go through every little what if scenario of the rule, but this is an overview of things that I've seen as REC and as field team leader that have gotten folks in trouble. And I think everything you see on here is here for a reason, because probably somewhere is a violation attached to that. And that's just the reality. We've seen some things, and I try to pass that along to prevent that from happening to anybody going forward. So to start with, a lot of what we do with water quality is dependent on whether a stream exists or not. And we have a definition of a stream. If anyone's been out with us before, this is the definition we've had for a long time. It has to meet three criteria. It has to meet all three of them. It has to be between defined banks. It has to lack terrestrial vegetation or have exposed parent material bed. So that means it's got flow enough so it actually washes things away. We're actually seeing gravel and dirt in the bottom of the stream. And this is the big one. It has to be hydrologically connected. It doesn't include rills or gullies and disturbed soils like skidder trail ruts and things like that. Back to the hydrologically connected, I've seen 4 and 5 foot wide streams cross a road and disappear completely, never to be seen again. So it does happen. So that hydrologically connected is very important. It has to connect to something. And if it's just ditch water that goes through a cross drain and out the other side and disappears and doesn't connect to anything bigger, it's not a stream by our definition. So it's very important. There's 2 examples. One on the left is a stream. You can see it's got a defined banks. You can see the dirt. If you look really close in the image, you can see some scoured soils, scoured bottom. And then if you look in the background, this hydrologically connects to a wetland. A little hard to see, but there is a wetland back there. The one on the right is not a stream. This was in eastern Maine. This was one of those that, for all intents and purposes, it looked like a stream. It entered the ditch. It ran down the ditch for a ways. It exited into the woods, and it turned into ditch water. It did not connect. There's no channel there. It just fanned out in this wet area and did not meet the definition of a stream. Another thing that comes into play with these rules is this forested wetland definition, or in this case, for our purposes, it's non-forested wetland, but it's easier to define what's a forested wetland and work backward. This is in our interpretations. So a forested wetland means a freshwater wetland dominated by woody vegetation that's at least 20 feet tall. Woody vegetation on the site must, and we've had to put something you can measure here, acceptable growing stock over 4.5 inches for more than 30 square feet basal area, at least 300 acceptable growing stock trees per acre, at least 20 feet tall, and they have to be wind firm. They can't be 3-inch fir that's 70 feet tall. They have to be something that's going to stand up. So those numbers should look familiar to you if you've ever worked with FPA. That's those numbers basically came right from our definition of forested out of FPA, what we consider forested. So these criteria are what we'll use on the ground to determine whether a wetland is forested or not. And these are things that any of you can measure. Any of you can stand it with a prism and figure out if you've got 30 square feet or not, or swing a stick and figure out if you've got 300 trees per acre, 20 feet tall. Here's an example. This has gotten folks in trouble in the past. And for the regulatory buffer or shoreland area, we don't measure from the open water edge. We measure from the upland edge of the non-forested wetland. So if you can see my pointer, that would be this over here on the edge. As you come around, you can see the edge of the non-forested wetland. Here it gets a little fuzzy. So you'd have to look at that criteria, the 300 trees per acre or the basal area, to figure out where that edge is. LiDAR is very useful for this. I know most of you have LiDAR on your iPad or or on your cell phones in the woods. I've seen it. I've seen it. So this is an example of this non-forested wetland idea. If you look really close down here, you actually see some sediment. And this was a violation of, not related to the wetland, but it was a road issue. It was a ditching issue, but you can see the sediment reaching the wetland. The other thing that we need to define is this notion of normal high water line. So we measure back for our regulated shoreland area from the normal high water line. Normal high water line means the line which is apparent from visible markings, changes in character of soil, prolonged action, and changes in vegetation. I know most of you have probably seen that before somewhere and understand that. But in the case of non-forested freshwater wetlands adjacent to streams and other water bodies, the normal high water line is the upland edge of the freshwater wetland, not the edge of the open water. And that's right out of the rule. So you've got a pond at the inlet of the pond, you've got a 3-acre non-forested wetland attached to the pond. That non-forested wetland becomes part of that water body and needs to be buffered. So here's another example. You can see the open water. This is actually a great pond, bigger than 10 acres. And then there's an extended non-forested wetland around the pond. For regulatory purposes, we would measure from this edge where the non-forested becomes forested. And we would measure back, in this case, 250 feet. So now let's talk a little bit about the shade requirements on streams. And this is where the drainage breaks come in. There is a difference. I just got done telling you we're looking for a consistent rule across the state, but there's an exception built into Chapter 21 just for the unorganized towns. So if you picture a watershed and think about a watershed as it develops into streams and works down into bigger streams and then rivers. If the drainage size is less than 300 acres, there's no shade requirement. Means you could clear cut right to the edge of it. Doesn't mean you should, but you could. Legally could. Now there's some other things that come into play, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, called shoreline integrity. But as far as vegetation and shade and 40% removal and all that other stuff, less than 300 acres, there's no shade requirement on those headwater streams. Once we break the 300 acre threshold down to the 25 square mile threshold, in the organized towns, all of that has a 75-foot zone and 3 options for shade. And that's the 40% removal, 60 square feet residual, or option 3, and outcome based. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So that's between 300 and 25. But in the unorganized, here's where the exemption comes in. It's still a 75-foot zone, but the rule says maintain shading. If you read down below, if you can read it, I don't know if you can see it on screen where you folks are, but that's the language from the exception, and it applies just to the unorganized territories. So from 300 acres down to 25 square miles, you're not bound to the 40% removal, 60 square feet. All you have to do is maintain shade, much like you're doing now. Once you break the 25 square mile threshold, now you have a 75-foot zone and all the options for shade. And then 250 is the same for both. And those are your bigger rivers, 3 options for shade as well on that. So I've got a schematic that shows this, couple schematics that show it. So this is the organized. You can see the 300 acre drainage points, the thin blue lines up here, the headwaters. All of this thicker blue, you have 3 options for shade in organized towns. You have 3 options in all of that thicker blue. You have to do 40% removal or leave 60 square feet residual until you hit the 25 square mile drainage point. Now watch, I'm going to change that. This is what unorganized looks like. So again, the headwaters, nothing changes up there. From 300 acres to 25 square miles, you still have shoreline integrity requirements, but all you have to do is maintain sufficient shade down to this 25 square miles. From 25 square miles to 50 square miles, that's when your 3 options kick in. That's when you have to do either a 40% removal, leave 60 square feet basal area, or an outcome-based option. So basically from 25 square miles all the way up to where the stream starts, it's a shade-only requirement. And then below 50 square miles, it's 250. 250 buffer, 3 options, just like it says in the rule. So I'll back up and show you organized again. So you can see in organized, the 250 kicks in at 25 square miles, but when I go to unorganized, the 250 doesn't kick into 50 until 50 square miles. So there is a difference. Unorganized is a little more liberal with the shading requirements and the zones on the streams. And again, this will all be recorded. These graphics are available to anyone that wants them. I'm happy to share the slide deck. If anybody wants these slides, I'm happy to share that. We can actually put that on the website if folks want it. So now let's talk about wetlands. So this is a big change for unorganized. And you'll see here, so nothing really changes with Great Ponds. Great Ponds have always been 250 and will still be 250. The difference now is wetlands attached to the Great Pond. You have to buffer around the whole thing. But the real big change is non-forested wetlands bigger than 10 acres will have a 250 around them. And that's a big change. Right now, it could be a 30 or 40 acre non-forested wetland, and all you have to do is leave shade. After January 2nd, it will be a 250 around those non-forested wetlands. And remember our definition of forested versus non-forested. So that's where that comes into play here to determine whether or not that's regulated. I've seen wetlands that we have regulated on our maps. Foresters have called me up and I've gone out there and it's 60, 80 square feet of cedar, black spruce, clearly a forested wetland, and the 250 zone goes away. And we could make that determination right there on the ground and say, nope, that's a forested wetland. We're good to go. You don't have to buffer at 250. So ground conditions dictate. So that's a big change in the unorganized for sure. So non-forested wetlands, great ponds and lakes, and coastal wetlands, really kind of not applicable for today. Those all have a 250 around them. And then the shoreline integrity kicks in for the smaller ones between basically 1/10 of an acre up to 10 acres. So anything between 1/10 of an acre non-forested or pond, a small pond, that has a 75 around it, but it really only comes down to shoreline integrity at that point. The key thing of that whole slide is these wetlands over 10 acres, non-forested, will have a 250. It's a major change. So here's some diagrams of what you can and can't do in the 75, and then the next one is the 250 zones. So this is a stream with a 75-foot buffer on it. You have 3 options for shade here. Here's our non-forested wetland. We bulge out around that because it's associated with the stream. So our 75 has to bulge around it. We have to maintain shoreline integrity. I'll talk about that in a little bit. That's kind of new. Within the 75, we can't have any cleared openings bigger than 2,500 square feet. So 50 by 50 roughly. So you could do small little groups. You could, if there's a little patch of fur there, you could take it, but you can't exceed 2,500 square feet. Also within the 75, no more than 40% volume removal on each acre within a 10-year period of trees 4.5 inches and up. That's a change. In the unorganized today, it's 6 inches and up. You can go down to 4.5 inches now for your 40% volume removal. Or here's a second option now in the unorganized. You can leave 60 square feet residual. So you have 2 options you can pick from now. It isn't just 40% or nothing. You can leave a 60 square foot residual if you've got wind firm stems that will allow you to do that. So the big things there are the cleared openings, no bigger than 2,500 in the 75, and then the 2 options up here for volume removals. I'm going to move on to the 250s. So here's a 250. So this is a river, great pond, non-forested wetland over 10 acres. Again, if your non-forested wetland attaches to a water body, you have to bulge around it. No slash below the normal high water line. I'll talk about slash in a minute. The 75 stays the same. No cleared openings more than 2,500 square feet. In the back of the zone, outside the 75, all the way to the 250, you're allowed to do patches that are just a little bit bigger. You can do a maximum cleared opening 14,000. If they're over 10,000 square feet, they have to be at least 100 feet apart. That shouldn't be different to anyone. That language is in the unorganized language now in chapter 27. And like the 75 that I just spent time describing before, you have two options now for volume removals. You can do your 40%, 4.5 inches and up, or you can choose to leave 60 square feet, whichever works out best in your situation. I always like in these presentations to put some examples of where things went bad. And this is an example where things went bad. This is a great pond down here in the left corner. You can see this is a non-forested wetland. This blue line is actually the high water line. This is the 75, and then this is all of the 250 back here. And you can see that the standards were exceeded here. We had openings in the 75 that exceeded 2,500 square feet, and then back here was essentially all clear cut. The whole back of the zone was wiped out. The important thing is you have to buffer around this non-forested wetland that attaches. Here's another violation. The blue line here is the normal high water line. Open water out here, but there's a fringe of non-forested wetlands. You can see there's actually no 75-foot violation here. This stayed under the 2,500 square foot threshold, as did these little patches. But the violation was here in the back of the zone. It's pretty well clear cut. This was an example of a logger did not look at the zoning maps at all. He just showed up and cut wood and didn't have a clue that any of this might be zoned. Here's an example of something that came out well. And this was a logger in the Dover Foxcroft area, called me up and said, look, I'm cutting on an island. There's a small causeway that gets me on the island, but the entire island is 250. The way the island was shaped, almost all of it was 250 zone. And he said, I don't want to get in trouble. So we went out, we took a look, we talked about his options for shade. We talked about the setbacks from the water. He did a really nice job here. You can see the lake in the background. The white way in the back is the actual water body. In this case, he chose a 60 square foot option. It worked out better for him. And he did a very nice job. These are the three options for shade. Option 1 is a 40% removal. I've talked about that before, but 4.5 inches and up in any 10-year period. For our purposes, basal area is equivalent to volume. Option 2 is 60 square foot basal, which a portion of it can be smaller than 4.5 inches. Okay, so 40 square feet of that 60 has to be bigger than 4.5 inches. 20 square feet of it can be between 1 and 4.5. So sometimes this works out okay if you've got like an OSR situation or advanced regen underneath. You want to thin the overstory, but you've got enough stuff underneath. You know, you may have some small fur. Just picturing a stand that might be 2 to 3 inch fur that's dog hair thick, and you want to pick a few trees off the top. You could do that and meet the 60 square foot because some of the basal area can fall in that 1 to 4.5 inches. There's a third option, outcome based. And that requires prior approval from the Maine Forest Service. It requires a plan to be presented to us. It has to offer equal or greater protection than our rules. So we have to look at the plan and decide whether or not it's going to provide equal or better protection. Outcome, there has been very few of these done in the past, but it is an option under statewide standards. And then just lastly, it's kind of goes without saying, but a well-distributed stand of trees, which is wind firm, must remain, and existing ground cover must remain. Somebody asked, I can't see the name, but do we have to choose only one option for every township when submitting a fawn? And the answer is no. You can pick different options for each harvest area, but option 3, that outcome-based option, also lets you mix and match on the same harvest. So if you've got a harvest area that's a couple hundred acres and you've got 2 or 3 water bodies in it that you want to do different things on those water bodies, you could do an outcome-based. It doesn't have to be super elaborate in that situation because you're essentially picking, you're mixing and matching, but we just need to know where you're mixing and matching. So you could do an option 3 and mix and match in the same harvest. So when you fill out your forest harvest notification, here are your options. You get to pick one, and that goes back to the question that I just had up here. Oops. Oh, Nathan, that was you. Sorry, I couldn't see the name. So yeah, Nathan, you can mix and match in the same watershed. This is new. Chapter 27 didn't directly have this information or didn't call this out. We had other ways around it. Obviously, if you put sediment into a water body, that's bad. But the statewide standards has this thing called shoreline integrity. And all timber harvesting operations must maintain shoreline integrity regardless of the size of the water body. So it doesn't matter if it drains 10 acres and it's a stream by definition, or if it's a river. You must maintain shoreline integrity. It's defined as disruption of shoreline integrity means the alteration, physical shape, properties, condition of a shoreline by timber harvesting. Basically, it's compaction, scarification, rutted soils, abnormal channel or shoreline cross section, case of flowing waters, a profile of character altered from natural conditions. I've got 2 really good examples of violations of shoreline integrity. One on the left, the skidders didn't want to drive over a snowmobile bridge and break it, so they just drove through the brook. And then the one on the right, I don't know what happened there. They just didn't follow any of the rules. And there is a brook here in the mud. But these are extreme examples of shoreline integrity violations, but I think you get the idea. We can't disrupt the natural channel of a stream. So that's new. That applies to all water bodies. Skid trails, yards, and equipment operation. This shouldn't be new to anyone. Filter strip charts. I know you've all seen them. They increase the slope, minimum 25 feet. Must divert water into unscarified filter strips. You can't have a direct termination into a stream or other water body. I think we're all familiar with that, but it's worth mentioning that still applies. So skid trail water crossings. All crossings of streams and rivers below the 25 square mile drainage point must use a bridge or culvert that meets sizing requirements. If you're crossing a water body below the 25 square mile point, you cannot just drive through the brook. Ernest asks, if you fill a stream with wood above 300 acre drainage for a crossing, must you remove it? Yes. And I'll get to that in a minute with a slash, Ernest. So all skid trail crossings must be designed, constructed, and maintained so that sedimentation is reasonably avoided, no substantial disturbance of the bank or stream channel, that speaks to that shoreline integrity. Fish passage is not impeded, and this is a new one in the chapter 21. Chapter 27 never specifically stated that you had to maintain fish passage. The word fish never shows up in that rule. It does now in chapter 21. Fish passage must be maintained. And then water flow is not unreasonably impeded. Again, we don't define that. I think when we see it, we know it. But that might go back to what Ernest said about leaving stuff in the stream in a crossing. Ernest asked, if you fill a stream with wood above the 300 acre drainage, must you remove it? So that could impede water flow. Slash treatment. Timber harvesting and related activities must be conducted such that slash or debris is not left below the normal high water line of any water body. So this is like the shoreline integrity. If it meets the definition of a stream or a non-forested wetland, for example, or a great pond for that matter, you cannot leave slash below the normal high water line.